Hi, Grandma here reading The House of 60 Fathers, and I'll be reading to the very end. And I'm beginning on page 176. Lieutenant Hampson has taken Tien Pao up in a plane, and they have flown over many of the refugees, but none of them were Tien Pao's parents. So they've gone along the railroad tracks, but now they're going to try going over to other dirt tracks to see if they can find his parents that way. Beginning on page 176. Now the plane had swept along both the narrow dirt roads. It had followed each one all the way until there were no refugees in either direction. All the distance in between, Tien Pao had looked down at refugees by the thousands and strung out along both roads miles upon miles, but his father and mother had not been among them. The sun was going down. On the last road, there was now only a farmer leading his water buffalo home from the day of plowing. He was carrying a little girl on his shoulder. The little girl looked up at the plane and waved. Tien Pao turned his head away. Would the lieutenant, on our way back to the airfield and the House of 60 Fathers, follow the railroad track once more? He asked heavily. The plane had once set out cross country. Tien Pao sat staring straight ahead. He did not care about the country below or care about anything. He knew only too well that his last hopeless request to go back along the railroad track was just that, hopeless. He'd known surely that first time that his father and mother were not among the refugees on the railroad track. It just prolonged the last little hope and tiny possible doubt a little longer until the time would come when he'd once more have to say, they are not there. Then the plane would let down on the airfield, then they'd ride in the Jeep to the House of 60 Fathers, and then there'd be no more hope. They'd just be emptiness and the final hard fact, which was that he was lucky, among all those thousands upon thousands of the homeless, to be adopted by his 60 American fathers. He somehow had to get used to that fact, but now he only felt empty. May I go sit alone back there in the plane? He whispered. It was doubtful that the men had heard the whisper, but both men nodded together, and the interpreter took Glory of the Republic, and Tien Pao slid from the seat. Behind the men's backs, Tien Pao pulled himself along, but he did not sit in the seat. He sat on the floor, put his arms on the seat, put his head in his arms, and held himself very still. It was not necessary to see any more what was down there. They were not there. Much later, the interpreter called out to him, Tien Pao, this you must see. I think the Lieutenant Hampson really wants you to see this, for he has taken us far around to where they are building a great new airfield beside the railroad track. It is much further down the railroad track than we went the first time, far beyond the refugees. Tien Pao got up. He knew they were doing it to distract him, and he dutifully walked back to the glassed-in nose of the plane and looked down. He gasped. Straight below them lay a huge airfield. It was enormous. It stretched flatly away, and many little roads ribboned away from it, winding in and out among the endless buildings. From here, high in the sky, it was as if a giant hand had just dropped clusters of buildings in clumps, had strewn others, lone buildings, helter-skelter, and then had wound the ribbon roads between them. Trucks and jeeps scuttled like water bugs along the little threads of lines that were the roads. Down over the flat stretches of grassy field crawled the flat beetles that must be huge bombing planes. Their own planes, still circling the field, dropped lower. Things got bigger. Down slid the plane. It made an enormous circle of the field at the new level. Now the mountains all around the field began rising up next to the plane. The plane banked. Tien Pao held his breath. For a moment, it almost looked as if one wing was going to scrape the side of the mountain. The last rays of the evening sun lay against the mountainside. Tien Pao could see the shadow of their plane sliding along the mountain. It slid over men working on the mountainside. They did not even look up as the shadow slid over them. They kept swinging big hammers. Some leaped from one pile of rocks to another pile, nimbly, like black coats in the mountain. Tien Pao grabbed Lieutenant Hampson's arm. "My mother told me of this," he jabbered in excited Chinese, "at the great field for airplanes at Hanyang that I never saw. She said my father and the men were like goats on the mountain. She said my father and the men broke down mountains with great dynamite blasts, and then they broke up the rocks from the blast to make crushed stone for the runways for the airplanes. And look, it is just what these men are doing. This isn't Hanyang, but oh, my mother told me of this, and then she promised me that the next day I would go along to see it too. But the river took me." The mountain was gone. The plane was cruising along another part of the endless field. It dipped still lower. And now there were women working below, an endless file of women, each one with a carrying pole from which hung 2 baskets. They shuffled along in a single long file that reached from a hillside where the men were scooping the basket full of dirt. Then the never-ending, never-stopping file of women shuffled on again, and up a huge wall of dirt that the women were building up underneath themselves, basket by basket. It was like ants carrying grains of sand. And here we have a picture of a woman with the baskets on the end of poles. They are building revetments for the bombers. That way they are protected from enemy air attack, the interpreter explained. Tien Pao hardly heard what he saw down below. It was too interesting and exciting. The walls of dirt that the women were building were in the shape of a U. The great mounds were open at only one end. The plane passed over a finished mound, and in it stood a huge bomber plane, protected by dirt walls on 3 sides. They were like stables, Tien Pao thought, stables for bombers. But then again, there was a row of partially finished mounds with women climbing up and down them with their little scoop baskets. A woman, just emptying her basket, looked up at the low, roaring plane flew over. Tien Pao screamed, "My mother! I saw my mother! My mother!" Lieutenant Hampson whipped around to him, startled. The interpreter stared down, but the plane flew on, and the mound was gone. Tien pummeled the lieutenant with hard, fierce fists. "My mother!" He pointed and pointed. "I saw my mother!" Lieutenant Hampson cast a startled look at the women down below, then at the interpreter, but he must somehow have understood that Tien Pao was screaming, and the interpreter forgot to translate. His eyes were searching along the revetments. "No, Tien Pao," Lieutenant Hampson said. "You couldn't have seen your mother. There's hardly a chance." It did not matter what the lieutenant said or in what language. Tien Pao did not hear him. The plane was going over buildings now. Never, never in all this enormous, complicated field would they find that one revetment again. Tien Pao tried to keep it in sight, but he couldn't. It was gone. He sank down in a sobbing heap on the floor of the plane. He beat the floor with his hands. He had lost his mother. For a moment there she had been, but he had lost her. Tien Pao, we'll go look. We'll go in for a landing, grab a jeep, and race out there. But you've got to understand this isn't a wheelbarrow. I can't just let go of the handles and set it down. We're going in now, then we'll grab a jeep and find your revetment." The lieutenant talked and talked. Tien Pao did not listen. Lieutenant Hampson spoke impatient words to the interpreter. The interpreter hastily told Tien Pao what Lieutenant Hampson had said. Tien Pao did not listen. He did not care what they said. He had seen his mother and he had lost her. Never, never in all this huge, complicated field would they find that one particular revetment. Darkness would fall. The workers on the field would go home. The plane was down. Then Tien Pao and Lieutenant Hampson, in spite of his bad leg, were running to a jeep standing beside a building. The interpreter came running behind, only he had remembered Glory of the Republic. They jumped into the jeep without anybody's permission. Lieutenant Hampson started the motor. A soldier came dashing out of the building, shouting at them, but Lieutenant Hampson just shouted something over his shoulder and kept going. Lieutenant Hampson looked at Tien Pao and said things. "The lieutenant says you mustn't build your hopes too high," the interpreter said weakly. Tien Pao did not hear him. He stared straight ahead. Never in all this horrible long bouncing and weaving among all these drives and half-finished little roads would they find the revetment. Already, Tien Pao was utterly confused. He hadn't the slightest idea which way they have to go. But then the jeep screeched around a short corner, and they were on a wider road. They shot past built-up revetments that had bombers standing in them. They passed some low ones that were just going up. And then the jeep roared right up to the high one on which his mother had been. Oh, Lieutenant Hampson knew. He'd known all the time. He could see things from the air and know just where they were on the ground and how to get to them. Tien Pao could have bawled with relief. He jumped up in the moving jeep, and Lieutenant Hampson hastily stopped it. As they were getting out of the jeep, a bomber out of one of the great revetments across the road began a thundering roar. The wind from the huge propeller almost knocked Tien Pao against the jeep. It scared Glory of the Republic so. He leaped from the interpreter's arms and bowled away as if blown by the terrific wind. The interpreter chased him. Tien Pao did not wait, but raced up the mound of dirt past the row of shuffling women going down with their empty baskets. Lieutenant Hampson came right behind him, and then Tien Pao stood in the exact spot where his mother had stood when she had looked up at the plane. He knew. Here she had stood and had looked up at him, but of course she didn't know. With the lieutenant, Tien Pao examined each stooped woman as she trudged wearily up the mound with her loaded scoop baskets. They had their heads so bowed against the weight and the climb, it was hard to see their faces in the gathering evening dusk until they emptied the baskets. Lieutenant Hampson stopped a woman who was emptying her basket at his toes. He stuffed some yen into her hand, and then, with an apologetic grin, he pulled out his handkerchief and tied it to her yoke. He pointed it out to Tien Pao. "As if you wouldn't know your mother a mile off, but all Chinese look alike to me, and I've got to prove it to you if she isn't here." When at last this woman that had the handkerchief tied around her pole, when at last this woman makes a circle, you'll know we have seen them all. And oh, I dread seeing that moment come. Tien Pao did not seem aware that the lieutenant was talking. He kept searching the faces. Soon it would be dark and they'd all go home. "Come soon now, mother, come soon." It kept saying itself over and over inside of him as if it would hurry her on. There were hundreds and hundreds of women, and always they came on, a few shuffling slow steps behind each other, backs bent, heads stooped, chins on chest, and then at last Lieutenant Hampson saw the white handkerchief. Slowly it came up the line. Slowly it climbed the mound. The lieutenant took Tien Pao's hand, held it tightly in his own. Now the woman was emptying her basket right before Tien Pao's feet, but Tien Pao would not give up. He turned his back on her and from the high mound searched the other revetments. The long night shadows were filtering down on the field, and still the work went on. At a sudden sound of singing, Tien Pao glanced down the field, and there came some 100 chanting women pulling a huge stone roller that was crushing the fine rock into a hard road for a new runway. An overseer marched beside the mass of tugging women, leaning in the ropes. He chanted, the women chanted back, and as they chanted, they strained forward and tugged the roller ahead. Tien Pao's hand jerked nervously in the lieutenant's grasp. Then, with a loud, wild yell, he jerked himself free, plunged down the revetment, plunged unseen past the interpreter coming up with Glory of the Republic, and tore madly across the crushed stone roadway straight at the roller. He plunged among the mass of tugging, chanting women. The roller stopped. There was an alarmed cackle of voices. The overseer barked loud, fierce words at the excited women, but the roller stood still. Tien Pao flung himself at a woman in the midst of the group. "My mother!" The overseer ranted and shrieked. It made no matter. The women stood, twisted in the ropes. They huddled around a kneeling, weeping woman who sobbed herself out against her son's chest. The women wept with her, laughed, asked bewildered questions that no one heard and no one answered. Then Lieutenant Hampson was there. He yelled something fierce at the ranting Chinese overseer, and behind him the interpreter with the little pig stopped to explain things to the overseer to calm him down. But Lieutenant Hampson elbowed his way in among the women, waded into the heap of kneeling women. Tien Pao's mother, her eyes streaming, looked blindly up at him. The father, she chatted wildly. He is there on the mountain. He too must know it is Tien Pao. I'll go get the jeep, Lieutenant Hampson shouted. Nobody heard him. Tien Pao's mother wrenched herself out of the harness rope, grabbed Tien Pao's hand, and together they broke out of the heap of excited, chattering women. Tien Pao, not knowing what he was doing, pulled away from her, dashed to the interpreter, grabbed the little pig, and tore back to his mother. Together, hand in hand, they started running toward the distant, darkening mountain. From far down the runway, Lieutenant Hampson shouted after them, The jeep! The jeep! What's the jeep for? You can't run all that way." They didn't hear him, and Lieutenant Hampson turned and went on a limping run for the jeep. He forgot about the interpreter waiting near the roller. He forgot about roads and runways. He set out after Tien Pao and his mother across the rough field. He caught up with them. He almost had to lift Tien Pao's mother bodily into the jeep. She was too bewildered in her happy, delirious joy to be able to comprehend anything. The lieutenant set out for the mountain. He couldn't reach it. The strewn, jagged rocks and enormous boulders hurled below the mountainside by dynamite blasts forced him to stop, far from the foot of the dug-away mountain. But Tien Pao's mother jumped up in the jeep, and in the fierce strength of her joy, she lifted Tien Pao high and screamed a terrible scream at the mountain. "It is Tien Pao! It is Tien Pao!" Her cry rang up the mountainside. Men stopped and looked down, and one man, halfway up the rocky hill, let his huge sledgehammer fall from his hand. He just stood, but then he bellowed it out. "It is Tien Pao!" He came plunging down. He came straight down, straight toward the jeep. He used no paths, but he could not run that fast, not down a mountain. He fell. He struggled up again and fell. He leaped up. All around him, the men were shouting at him, running toward him. He half turned to them as he lunged on. "It is Tien Pao!" he bellowed, and that answered all and explained all, and he came on in a terrible plunging strides. Tien Pao's mother sank down on the seat, her strength suddenly all gone. Her whole body trembled. She clung fiercely to Tien Pao, and she cried. Softly she cried, and Tien Pao cried with her as they watched his plunging father, and in his happiness he had to tell Lieutenant Hampson, who could not understand, "Oh, it was my mother, and I knew it." She had been on the revetment, but they called the younger women down to pull the roller to finish the job before dark. Oh, I knew it, I knew it. And my little sister is with neighbors in a little village near the airfield. Suddenly he remembered his pig. He grabbed up Glory of the Republic. He hugged him. And as Tien Pao finished talking, his mother looked her gratitude at the lieutenant. It is Tien Pao, she softly told the lieutenant, as if it were a wholly new and unbelievable thing. It is Tien Pao. And in her gratitude, this timid, shy Chinese woman leaned forward and laid her hand on the lieutenant's arm and talked to him in earnest Chinese, and the tears rolled unheeded down her cheeks. It is Tien Pao, she said again, and tomorrow, and tomorrow, and tomorrow, and all the days to come, there will still be my son, and the house won't be too empty, and the anxious heart too full. Oh, tomorrow, and then will come a day when there will be no more shooting, no more running from the shooting, and no war. And there will come a day when the little family of Tien will go back to their little village and live in peace. Ah, tomorrow and tomorrow. Ah. She had no more words. She choked on them, and her tears streamed. And then came his father, and his mother was clutching him fiercely again. There sat the lieutenant, half turned, and he did not understand what the mother had said. Ah, but he did understand. He understood. The heart understands without words. And that's the end. Now, there are a couple things I want to talk to you about concerning this book. One is who the book is dedicated to. It says, for Wally, in memory of the compound in Paishi, China, and of little lost Panza. This book is based on a true story. The author, Minder de Jong, was a journalist in China at this time. And if you'll remember, way back in the middle of the book, there were two men who found Tien Pao and the pigs sleeping, and they were taking pictures of them. And I think that's where the author of the book met the child who he later renamed Tien Pao. He tried after the war to bring the boy back to the United States, but he wasn't able to, so he was very close to the boy. Now this book, on the website 100 Books Every Child Should Read, is one of the books mentioned, and I'm going to read why it is such an important book for children to read. In this book, de Jong views the complexity of wartime from the vantage of a Chinese peasant boy, the thrill of witnessing the routing of an advancing Japanese column by a solitary strafing plane alongside the horror of watching terror-stricken horses drowning, his disgust at a starving child eating mud, along with the visceral joy of his first taste of chocolate, the selfish desperation of refugees throwing themselves on a packed train. De Jong presents the fear, the loneliness, the chaos of war, along with the comfort of human and porcine companionship. Both frightening and reassuring, this is one of the most powerful stories of wartime ever written for children. Well, I hope you learned a little bit about Chinese history, World War II, and about war, and about a child who was able to survive the war and have his story told. Bye-bye.